Hi everyone, this is Planet Mitch with a cold from Planet 5D World Headquarters, which is my house. Today we're going to be talking with Jem Schofield, our good buddy from the C47.com, who amazingly seems to make a video a day and actually gets them put up on the internet. And they're not inappropriate videos, they're actually very good. So you should check out the C47.com and we'll talk about that and many other things. But first, I want you to meet Jem Schofield.
Hey, everybody.
Hi,
Thanks
Jem.
for having me. Hey, Mitch.
It's my pleasure, and you know that.
And our second time around, so thanks for having me on the show again. I appreciate it.
Well, you know, I am going to have to start charging you.
Wow.
Yeah, if I could only make money doing this, that would be a whole big different deal.
Me too.
Jem and I were both at the NAB, National Association of Broadcasters conference this past week in Vegas. Jem was teaching. What were you teaching, by the way?
Well, I teach there every year. I was teaching production and post. I was doing some classes on digital cinema cameras. That's everything from DSLRs all the way up to the Arri Alexa. Small format cameras, audio, and then some stuff for Final Cut Studio. And then I did a small project for Canon, so an actual production. And now I'm in San Francisco, hanging out. I was just teaching a 3-day workshop that I finished up yesterday.
Wow. You are a busy man. Hardly ever at home.
I miss home, for sure.
I bet you do. All right, well, the first thing you mentioned there was suddenly, oh, there, I mean, suddenly, while you were talking, I'm like, well, we'll talk about that first, and then it went in one ear and out the other. That's what happens when you have a cold, and you've been at NAB, and you've had family over for 4 days after that, visiting you at your house. It's just insanity. All right, you mentioned you were doing some teaching for Final Cut.
Yes.
So let's jump in and talk about Final Cut, the new. Were you at the presentation? Did you get to see any of that?
I was at the presentation for the entire thing at the Super Meet.
Right.
And yes, I did. I saw all.
Do you have any opinions? Because I was not there. I didn't get an invite to that.
Got it. So if anybody is interested in Final Cut Studio or Final Cut Pro, then they've probably watched the footage online from the presentation. You know, sort of the almost bootlegged footage that's floating around the internet of the entire presentation. And what Apple has done, which Apple is very good at, is they have basically started over. They've created a 64-bit application that is sort of rethinking what a nonlinear editing application could be. I think in a lot of ways we can think of it as a 1.0 application, because it is not anything that Final Cut Pro is at the moment. It edits video, it deals with audio, but almost everything else is different. And I have to say that, you know, you hear all of this stuff where people say it's iMovie Pro and it's
right.
iMovie-like, and there's actually a lot inside of iMovie from a functionality standpoint that could potentially make an editor's life easier. It's just whether or not somebody wants to rethink how they are editing to a certain degree. And it's been a while since I've been excited about new applications, and this year with things like Final Cut Pro 10, that is the official name of the product, though I like to call it FCPX. I think that sounds better. I think we have something that's going to be exciting. Whether or not it's going to be stable, whether or not it's going to get adopted initially by everybody in the professional post environment, I don't know. But I do know that everybody who uses Final Cut Pro will probably download that $299 application in June, and they'll start messing with it. Yeah. So
did you happen to live through the iMovie transfer when they switched versions to, you know, very similar to what is happening now?
Yes, I did. I mean, I don't use iMovie that much. I do some iLife training, some stuff for Apple, where sort of take people who want to learn the basic concepts of production and move into post and go over those things. So I'm very familiar with iMovie 11. because I've been doing some training with that.
Right.
And there are some similarities in the thinking process, but Final Cut Pro 10 is a very different application in its functionality, what it can do, and even things like the precision editor that's in iMovie is much more advanced in Final Cut Pro 10. And it clearly is a professional application. It's just whether or not people will like the functionality of it. I think if somebody's coming into editing from the beginning, first time, they don't have that history of using Media Composer, Premiere Pro, Final Cut Pro, a more standard video editing application, then I think that they'll be able to get into the workflow of Final Cut Pro 10 very easily. I think it's people who really have, the brick wall that editing has to be a certain way forever that will have a very hard time with that. But I think the majority of people are somewhere in the middle, and I think they're willing to take the time to see how that tool functions. I can see some things in there, though I haven't used the application at all. I can see some things in there that would make workflow much faster. And it's interesting because the big news with Premiere Pro is the Mercury engine,
right?
And it's real time, and being able to work with codecs like H.264 or their various flavors, AVC HD, AVC Cam, blah 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 blah, and being able to edit those in real time. And if you watch the presentation from the Super Meet, it's almost like that was the first thing that they talked about for Final Cut Pro. It was almost the least important part. That was the given, that you would be able to work in real time without rendering, and it was the shift in thinking of editing that was really the big deal. So I think it's exciting. I don't know what it's going to turn out to be, but I'm excited about software, and I have not been...
Sorry.
Hold it together there. Hold it together. I'm excited about software now, and I really haven't been excited about software in a long time. I've been excited about plugins, but not about applications. So yeah.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I have, I traditionally am a stills photographer, and I'm still trying to move into doing video. And most of the time, what I've been doing, like the little reviews and the little videos like at NAB, iMovie's done what I needed it to do, and so I've never taken the leap forward to go to jump into Final Cut or Premiere. So I think this will be my introduction to actually moving forwards, especially since I'm so familiar with iMovie. So hopefully that'll be very interesting.
Yeah, I hope so.
One of our chat room guests would like to know, do you think Final Cut Pro X will support, and I probably shouldn't say X, I should say 10.
10.
Will
Yeah.
support native 3D or Blu-ray authoring?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that with the crystal ball that is, my history with teaching pro apps, that the first app that I ever taught, and I've taught now for 12 years, 11 years, is DVD Studio Pro. So I really started as a DVD author and a motion graphics person. And DVDs, optical discs, have not, and I don't think will ever be, part of Apple's overall roadmap as we go forward.
Right.
They look at distribution as digital distribution that happens through something that has bandwidth. It's not about a physical disc. So I would not be surprised if that functionality is not beyond what we have in the current version of Final Cut Studio. 3D is a bigger question mark because I've been teaching motion for a long time, and it's really what we call a 2.5D application. It's like moving cards, which are two-dimensional, in a three-dimensional space. And there's a question from a lot of people whether or not we're going to have other apps. It clearly looks like we have a robust primary and secondary color corrector inside of Final Cut Pro 10, which brings up the question as to whether or not color will also be a separate application where it's being integrated. And Soundtrack Pro is an application that could theoretically become part of Final Cut Pro 10. It could not. I think the bigger question marks are things like motion. DVD Studio Pro hasn't changed as an application in a very, very, very long time. The Blu-ray functionality that we get right now is really coming from functionality that's within Final Cut Pro, not in DVD Studio Pro. So my guess is that I could definitely see an evolution of 3D. I would love to be able to place 3D objects in a 3D space inside of either Final Cut Pro or Motion, but I wouldn't get my hopes up for Blu-ray. And quite frankly, I personally don't know a lot of people who are doing a lot of Blu-ray distribution right now. It's not that it's not done. It can be archival. The sizes of the discs are relatively small, 25 gigs, 50 gigs. We're dealing with putting 16 and 32 gig cards into our cameras now, and they're very slow. You know, read-write speeds are incredibly slow. So I'm not saying I don't want that function. It's nice to have that, but I don't think it's part of Apple's, you know, big plan. You got some fancy animation going on over there with these picture-in-pictures. It's tripping me out over there.
I'm
yeah.
sorry. I didn't mean
no, good.
Trip you out.
Look, Motion is the little app that could have been. Hey, come on, that's not fair. Go ahead.
Well, that same person who hasn't chosen a nickname yet, please do. No one knows yet what support is in Final Cut Pro 10 for plugins or professional use like XML and EDL, etc.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are still undefined there.
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental difference between Final Cut Pro 10 and prior versions of Final Cut Pro, which are based on a code base that was originally developed and, you know, basically bought from Macromedia, this application called KeyGrip, is that the apparency is that Final Cut Pro 10 is not really an application that's built on QuickTime. And this is a fundamental shift for Apple. It's built on OS functionality like Grand Central and Core Image and Core Animation. And what that means is that they can now, as a 64-bit application, leverage your system much more effectively, use more RAM, take advantage of that graphics card more effectively, use multiple cores, and in the end that just means speed. There'll still be varying degrees. Just because you can edit natively or supposedly can edit natively ABC, HD, and H.264 stuff doesn't mean that you shouldn't transcode to ProRes. You know, iframe-based you know, stuff is generally going to give you better performance. You're also going to be dealing with something that well, we don't know. I'm not gonna try to guess on that, but I'm gonna say that there are distinct advantages to transcoding to an iframe-based codec. I'm assuming that that's going to happen in the background. That would be my hope, that we can bring in footage that's natively H.264, start editing it, and then in the background it's transcoding it to an iframe-based codec. So that when we, you know, we're ready to color correct it and we're ready to add graphics to it and do all kinds of fancy stuff, that we're in a better situation. But really, I'm pretty much in as much of the dark as everybody else on that, and I will probably be, along with everybody else, even though I'll start to teach it very quickly, be downloading that same software in June with everyone. So yeah. So yeah.
So help me out with the question. You just said iframe based, and I think that's the first time I've heard that. I mean, I've heard people say ProRes, you know, different things, but what is it? I know what iframe means in terms of HTML. What does it mean in terms of editing?
Well, you know, it's very confusing because we have different definitions for the same thing. And in fact, even Apple, if you use something like iMovie or you use certain consumer-based camcorders, there is a flavor of compression there called iframe. And it's generally a 960 by 540 based codec that is being used as an option when you transcode or convert your footage from your camera to iMovie to edit it, and they call it iframe. That's what the name of the codec is.
Okay.
But what we really mean when we say iframe is we mean intraframe, and it means that every single frame of video that's being either captured by the camera and recorded, or that we are converting from something like H.264, which is a group of pictures-based codec where we have, you know, sort of one real frame. We have 24 frames of video, and if you split those in half and you have two groups of pictures of 12 frames each, there's usually one intra-frame, which is the full frame of video, and then we have 11 virtual frames, and they're just sort of, you know, little pieces of information, bidirectional predicted frames. So when we convert our footage or we transcode it to ProRes or other certain types of compression, then we convert it to something which is called an iframe based codec, which is now every single frame of video is a full frame. It has all of the information, and it's much easier to work with that footage because we're not trying to decompress and reconstruct those frames. And H.264 can be very complex because it's not just decompressing and putting back those virtual frames into full information, but when it's being compressed, they sometimes even reorder those frames. So it's now got to put them back in the same order. Now you put a color corrector on it, now you start to put filters on it, start transitions. It becomes a very complicated world. We can see that it can be handled with something like Premiere Pro, but I think that Apple's approach looks like it's going to be a good approach. And again, my hope is that we can start to work natively with those H.264 files, but we have an option where we can transcode in the background to something like ProRes, and then we can finish our project that way. That would be ideal.
Cool.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for explaining that.
No worries. Yeah.
All right. So let's. Go ahead.
I do want to say that, yes, hopefully that we can get around the horrible gamma issues because QuickTime does rear its ugly head. So I'm just acknowledging the unnamed Ustreamer 424129.
Well, you read those numbers better than I do. All right, so let's move on to some hardware discussion. Thank you for
Let's do it.
For talking about Final Cut Pro. The first booth I was in was the Canon booth.
Yeah.
During the show. Not much new there, obviously. They do have the new plug-in that you mentioned in your notes, the log and transfer version of their E1 plug-in. Plus, they did show the new Cine Zooms, but there wasn't a whole lot. Well, and let's not forget the Technicolor Cine Style, which was also.
Yes, it's on my list.
I know.
Yeah, on my list. Yeah, it's important stuff. It's important. That's a big one. We're going to talk about that a little bit.
Well, let's do that.
Really? Right now?
Sure, it's on the list.
Okay, let's do it. So, talk about being excited about something, but really having no idea what the outcome's going to be. Most of you, I don't know if I'm going to assume, but I think a lot of you may have heard that Technicolor and Canon have worked together now. This is really, from what I understand, this is really something that Technicolor initiated because there are a lot of people who are now shooting footage on 7Ds and 5D Mark IIs. I would say more 7D footage because the size of the sensor is much closer to a Super 35 millimeter sensor. Right. And they're now passing that information over to Technicolor, and they're saying, make this work with our F-35s and our Arri Alexas and our high-end digital cinema cameras. And the problem is, wow, there it is, FilmBot. The problem is that we have limited latitude in these fantastical little cameras called HD SLRs, and we are taking all of this information, and we all know what's happening there, line skipping and subsampling and 8-bit 420, and the problem is that every single picture style, every single piece of footage that we pull off of a CF or an SD card on a Canon DSLR is in something called Rec 709. And Rec 709 is essentially the color space that we use that's the standard for HDTV. So it's a broadcast space. And it's pretty limited. It's probably at best 7 or 8 stops of latitude, probably more like 6 or 7. So that's pretty ugly business. So what the fine folks at Technicolor did to basically give them their own sanity is they said to Canon, we need to figure out a way to take the information that's captured from the sensor, and we want to convert that information into something called log, which is very different than Rec 709. Basically what log does is it takes all of the information. What was that just went over my head? That was interesting.
Don't worry about it. Just keep talking.
Wow, it's if it was in a room that freaked me out. I'm in that hotel room in San Francisco. I got this little thing coming over here. That's pretty freaky. Look, okay, that's fine. So we've got log, so logarithmic. So we have a linear, basically, situation when we're recording information, which has all of the data from our shadows to our highlights. And then what has to happen is we have to put that into something in the digital world that we can work with. Now we put it into Rec 709, we have that limited color, we have that, you know, those 6 or 7 stops of latitude. If we can convert it to something called log, which is what things like the Arri Alexa do, they remap all of that information from the sensor. There it is. That's pretty hot. They remap all of that information. You know I see everything. So they remap all of that information, and they try to give you the most amount of latitude, the most for you. So we all know about the flat picture style, right? You know about that, Mitch.
Yes, sir.
So it's like taking the flat picture style and making it much better. It means that we can go into those highlights, we can go into those shadows, we can get more detail out of them. It makes it easier to work with the footage. So we're hoping that that's the case when this free cine style or picture style comes out from Technicolor. We're all going to load that up as one of our custom picture styles and start testing it and shooting with it and seeing if we get a lot more flexibility with what we can do when we grade and color correct our footage in post.
Well, one of the things that sorry, one of the things
No worries.
I when I talked to the Technicolor guys about that, and I finally sort of understood all that stuff that you were talking about, my understanding still was that it wasn't going to matter to most of us Joes out there, that you almost had to have the Technicolor post-processing equipment in order to really take any advantage of that. Is that true?
Well, I don't know if that's true. I mean, it sounds like everybody can take advantage of it. I can tell you this, that Final Cut Pro can recognize log files. Okay. And so if you shoot on an Arri Alexa, then you are recording, let's say, to an S/S card in ProRes 4x4, 4444, or in ProRes HQ. That information in the camera can be laid down as ProRes, but in log, as opposed to in log C is what they call it in an Arri Alexa. On a Sony camera, they call it S-log. When you're shooting with a red camera, they call it basically raw. That's their sort of flavor of capturing as much latitude, as many stops of information. And the idea in all of these situations is that we want to, in especially narrative work or commercial work, take that information that we shot and have as much latitude as possible. I'm assuming that we're going to be able to bring that information into Final Cut, and it's going to recognize that remapping of information, and we're going to be able to work with it. But it's a little unclear. Yeah, I think that based on what I'm understanding, we are going to be able to take advantage of it. I think that that's the big news. But we will find out on April 30th, which is when it's supposed to be released.
Right. Sorry. You know, this.
Yes.
As soon as I try to say something, this welling up of coughing that I've been doing for the last 3 days. So what else in the Canon booth? Did you get a look at the new Cine Primes? The news
I did.
Primes?
The Cine Zooms I did. The PL mount. And if you don't know what PL mount stands for, it's an Arri locking mechanism that is the industry standard for Super 35 millimeter cameras, for film cameras. It stands for positive lock. That's what PL stands for. And
I didn't know that.
There you go. So interestingly, Canon has released 2 zoom lenses that are $45,000 and $47,000 respectively. So for the average Joe, you know, just sort of a no big deal, and you can pick up the pair for, you know, a cool $92,000. And they are relatively lightweight. They have very little breathing, which means that when you're changing your focus, you're not seeing basically the apparency that you're also changing your focal length. And that's very important with cine lenses. Most of your audience probably knows that if you're using zoom lenses, let's say we're using Canon L glass, if you take a 24 to 70 f2.8 lens and you change the focus, that there's very little breathing. But then you take something like the 70 to 200 f4, which is a great lens, but it tends to breathe a lot. It looks like somebody's exhaling, inhaling, and exhaling. It's like a movement,
Right.
but what we're really doing is changing the focus. And so I did try them. I was very impressed, and it's interesting because at the moment, Canon does not have a camera that they're selling with
Right.
a PL mount.
Right.
So it opens up discussions. You know, we like to think about stuff and talk about it. So there you
Well,
go.
I was just assuming they wanted to sell a bunch of adapters for the people to use them on their 5Ds.
Yeah, yeah. You know, why not? So I think what it means is Canon is definitely looking at the market as a larger market. The Technicolor story, the Cine Zooms, the updating of the log and transfer plugin. These are all really interesting things. The fact that we can breathe new life into a camera like the 5D Mark II, which is what now we're probably at about 2.5 years now on that life cycle.
Right.
We put that Technicolor Cine style in, and if we can use that effectively, that takes the camera to a whole nother level in terms of what we can do with it. It still has the same compression and all of that, but if we get more latitude, if we can remap the information that's being put in there and not be forced to work in Rec 709, then we may be able to make prettier pictures. Could be good. Yeah.
All right, on a similar tone, I think that what I'd like to dive into, did you get a chance to see the Zacuto, I always have to think what this acronym means, single chip camera evaluation in their booth? You had to have an invite, so maybe you didn't get to see it.
No, I was teaching.
Okay.
Tell me about this. What? Oh, I know what you're talking about. So this is the sort of the next round of camera comparisons where they took the F3, the FS100U, they took the F35, they took the basically the large sensor cameras out there, the majority of them being Super 35, and they did an evaluation of those cameras and how they performed.
Correct.
I did. I read the results of that, but I did not actually watch the presentation yet.
I did.
Yes, you watched it. Was it comfortable? How was it?
I had to stand up because I was late. But anyway, I'd like to see it again 3 or 4 more times, because the first time through, you're kind of simply trying to understand what they're showing. I mean, again, I'm not, at this point, totally educated on all the different camera models and all the stuff that you're teaching me. I'm learning as we go. And watching the evaluation was fascinating, because you get to finally see, number one, the thing that I really liked the most was that they used the same lens on all the different cameras.
Right.
So it wasn't a situation where you were comparing apples to oranges. You were actually really almost effectively, because there's still some variables in there about different settings and compressions and stuff that across the board they all use, you know, different color spaces and that kind of stuff. But in this particular example, you're finally getting to compare apples to apples and see the whole product line from the $100,000 camera, and I don't know what the high end really costs, but you know, $50,000 down to the Canon 7D, which is $1,000, $1,700, and you can actually really see the details in that whole range and see what impacts. And they had 6, I think, different tests, and each of the tests shows different winners, if you want to call a winner, in each category. So I think that was pretty phenomenal as well, and people are going to really enjoy it. So what you're going to see eventually is what they were doing at the show was they were showing the single chip camera evaluation in a tent, and they were recording people's responses to the survey, or to the what they saw on the screen. And what that is going to become is the Shootout 2011, because last year they had Shootout 2010, where they put a bunch of people in a room and showed a somewhat similar thing. So there's really two pieces to the equation. There's the evaluation, and then there's going to be the bigger picture, which is the shootout itself.
Yep. Yep.
Now, there isn't a winner or loser in any of this, but one of the things that I really took away from it was the real... You know, my father always used to tell me, son, you get what you pay for. And in reality, that's really still true here. Even though we love what the 5D and the 7D do, if you look really closely in the details behind what's going on in the RED and the F3 and the film cameras, there's a lot more stuff that can be seen when you really start pulling out the details.
Absolutely. And that actually goes to a certain degree to what we were talking about with the cine style, picture style, which is the ability for a camera to fully take advantage, or as much as possible take advantage of the information that's being captured from the sensor.
Right.
And that's why when you take a camera and you record Rec 709, it's throwing out tons of the information that the sensor is capturing. So when we look at cameras like the F35 and the Phantom Flex, and even going down to a camera like the F3, those cameras are optimized, and the F3 will be really optimized with the firmware update that's coming out soon to really take advantage of being able to capture a lot more information off of the sensor. But there are other issues that people need to understand about those cameras, especially in the Sony cameras, which I really, really love. I mean, the camera that I'm most excited about that's come to market in, sort of recently is definitely the PMW F3 from Sony. And a lot of people are excited about it. And when the firmware update comes out for that camera, you're going to be able to pull a RGB 4444 S-Log, from that dual link HD SDI from the camera. And what that means is you are, in theory, going to be able to capture very similar amounts of information, as many stops or as close to it as even a camera like an F35. So we take a look at a camera, like that, and there's a reason that Sony's talking about 4K and 8K cameras, because if there's no F65, then people look at an F3 that costs under $20,000 with the firmware update, and they say, well, why am I getting an F35? And now the shootout tells you some other things, but remember that the F3 didn't have the firmware updates.
Right.
So you may be capturing a 10-bit 422 recording from that or output, but you're not doing S-Log, and that's different. And so I think we'll see that F3 surprise a lot of people. But Sony designs their sensors, interestingly enough, because they want people to have this. They design their sensors so that they have a lot more, basically, ability to capture the full spectrum of color, and especially in the red spectrum. And so we have issues, and you may or may not have talked about it on Planet 5D in the past. People have problems with cameras like the Sony EX1 and the EX3. F35 is actually one of the cameras, very expensive, where we have something called IR contamination, that when you shoot within certain lighting conditions with certain types of fabrics and things like that, that you start to see blacks become maroon-ish in color. And the way you handle that is you have to put some sort of IR filter on there. But Sony doesn't want to limit color spectrum that sensor can capture things at. They could easily cut that. So a lot of people think that it's a mistake in the camera, and they actually took the EX1R and they actually fixed that problem. But what they're doing is they're also reducing the color response that the sensor is capable of creating. So there's a lot of crazy stuff going on there. So that shootout is, it's great. I think that Zacuto is doing a great job of, allowing us to take a look at what the differences are to these cameras. There's obviously some hardcore sort of, factual scientific stuff in there, but some of it also boils down to subjectiveness,
Right.
personal preference of the image.
Right.
And yeah, I also played with the FS100 quite a bit when I was at NAB, and that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was especially obvious in the last test they did with skin tones that that was very, very much preferential, I think, into what you would rather like to see.
Yeah. Yes.
All right.
Absolutely.
Someday this cough will go away.
It'll happen.
It'll
I
happen.
promise.
So, you have anything else that you want to say about that? But you didn't see it, so actually, I will say in the room that I was in, several of the people really liked the F3's results.
Yes.
So, it seemed to be winning many hearts.
It is. It's a very, very exciting camera. The F3. It has a tremendous amount of potential. If you're in a market that's a hot market, a lot of people are buying them and putting them out on rental because they're going out the door so fast.
Right.
They are, it's a true 35 millimeter sensor, and it is designed to resolve to 1920 by 1080. So the photo sites, are humongous. And what that means is that you can shoot effectively at 6400 ISO, clean. That's crazy. Crazy, insane.
Yeah.
It's good stuff. Yes. Good. So what do you want me to talk about next? I'm ready.
I'm sorry, I was just reading some of the
No.
comments.
Yeah. Or maybe we'll answer some things that people are asking.
I guess one of the questions still is that, Red is realistically the only one that's talking still about, I shouldn't say the only one, there are a couple of other cameras that are doing raw output, but the Sony
Right.
F3 doesn't have raw output, right?
Well, not really, but the thing that people have to understand is that Red RAW is not uncompressed. It is still a compressed format. It's their flavor. It is, at least based on my understanding, we even Arri has a RAW format, but they also have log C, and Sony has S-Log. And really what this all boils down to is how do we capture and get as much information off of that sensor and be able to work with that in post. We commonly will, in production, actually output to the client a Rec 709 image. And an Arri Alexa has a very clever little trick, and this is not uncommon for video cameras, where when you're outputting what people are monitoring on set, it's showing them a Rec 709 image, which is a sort of baked image that looks like it has nice saturation and it's got contrast in it. It kind of looks like maybe sort of what the final image would look like. But what's being captured to the cards or the external recorder is log C or S-Log or whatever this format is. And so the client doesn't get freaked out because they're seeing a completely flat image that has no contrast, basically has no sharpness, has very little saturation. But what we're getting in post-production is we're getting the ability to shape that image and be able to do a lot with that. Now, there's a big difference between 8-bit and 10-bit, a lot of difference. So even with this Cine style on the 5D Mark II, we're still confined to an 8-bit space. So we're going to get more latitude, but we're not going to be able to do what we're going to be able to do with a 10-bit or a 12-bit codec. And that's, also part of the equation. So Red is amazing. We also have for the first time, a workflow for Red that goes beyond having to debayer the information and go to something like Storm or some other, solution to basically create a pleasing image with the Red footage, which is that they're now saying that the Key Pro Mini is a supported device to be able to record up to ProRes HQ directly from the Red camera. So that's going to be really interesting to see how that works. I don't know how that boils down to a workflow, except for ProRes will probably be able to be used right away. When you pull in Arri Alexa footage off of an S/S card, it is in log. But you can bring it into Final Cut Pro and you can start to push and pull that image. You can send it to color and do all kinds of crazy stuff. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Yes.
I'm sorry.
That's what I got for it.
And
No, good.
And about to sneeze.
Okay, go.
I
Bless
said
you.
I said that before.
Bless you. Oh, you did it this time.
Did it this time. Sorry. Filmbot says Red Epic has uncompressed options, and Red M and MX are compressed. Anyway.
It may be true. That may be the case.
And for most of our readers, we're talking about a stuff that's way over their heads.
Okay, so let's go back to talking about. Let's go talking about other things like.
Well,
yeah.
While we were at Zacuto, and I'm wearing their shirt today, but that's not just because they're a sponsor.
I like the way you did that.
I think one of the things that was the big highlight for me was that we had the battle this year of the NAB EVFs, the electronic viewfinder. Zacuto came out with one. Red Rock had announced one earlier, and they've pulled it back. Small HD has a new one that they are going to have out by June. Cineroid was there in force with their 2 or 3 different EVFs that they have.
Yes.
And I think there was yet another that I never even saw, but did you get to play with any of them, and do you have any input on those?
Yeah, I did get to play with them a little bit. It seems like the companies that are really at the forefront right now of those are the companies you're talking about. We've got Zacuto, Cineroid, and I would say that we have to say that the DP4 from Small HD was announced at NAB. So we've got sort of 3 companies and some other companies out there which had some electronic viewfinders at the show. I think it's an important market. I think that the idea of being able to get that picture away from the camera is important, and it allows us to work with a shoulder-mounted, smaller format camera and not have to offset the camera to make that camera sit in front of your face. So I think that that's definitely something that's not only pertinent to DSLR cameras, but it's really important for cameras like the FS100 from Sony.
Right.
Because that little screen is sitting basically on that little Hasselblad camera, and that's not going to work unless you put it in front of you.
Right.
And that's not really great from an operator's standpoint to have a camera here with a big screen here. We want to sort of, kind of have some freedom and movement. So it's definitely a market. Everybody seems to be taking a very similar approach. Nobody's doing a true high-def screen, an 800 by 480, but a tight pattern. And the real difference between each of them is going to be their software. It's going to be, the functionality of it. Obviously, Zacuto's going with the Z Finder as the basis of your loop. Still, from what I've tried, probably the best loop on the market. The most comfortable to use, and that makes a lot of sense. And I've used the Cineroid before. I think it's a good product. I still think that the Zacuto loop is more comfortable, and I have not tried the Small HD yet, though I know that they are a passionate company that works really hard to make their products better over time. There's been a long sort of consistent history where they not only make better products, but they also continue to take the products like the DP6 and make them better with firmware. And so I think they're the real deal. I think that Small HD is definitely in the market now. And then, of course, we have some other monitors that are not electronic viewfinders from companies like Marshall, and they're really getting into the small format, high definition monitor game now. And I've always really liked Marshall's monitors. Their picture quality has always been incredible. They know this space really well. They're very serious about the broadcast monitoring space, and so they could come out with some really interesting things. In fact, they have now come out with a box that's coming out soon, which allows you to do an HDMI to HD-SDI conversion for about $700 or $800. So you don't have to have that whole black magic sort of wonky donkey solution. So that's pretty cool. And that's something that we need on set, at least with these current crop of DSLRs. Don't let me forget to talk about the lockable HDMI cable, by the way, which is very cool.
I saw you talk about that.
That's pretty amazing. Yeah, okay, good.
Well, and I wish I could come up with the name of it. There were so many things there as as I'm sure you experienced,
Yeah.
to see that there's no way you can see it all unless you're just running from booth to booth and not spending any time talking to anybody. I don't know what it's like for you. I assume people come up and talk to you, but I was constantly being, and this is not a complaint, in case anybody's wondering, I really was blessed to have a bunch of people come up to me and say, well, you know, I read Planet 5D daily or weekly or whatever, and as much fun as that is, that really slows you down in terms of getting around to see all the stuff that's there.
Yep.
There was one, you were talking about the HDMI to SHD, the acronym pool. Somebody told me on the very last day about a product, and maybe I can pull it up on the phone because I took a picture of the business card. I'm not going to find it fast enough. Maybe while you're talking.
What kind of product is it?
It was like it was a cage with a box on the back that was sort of a fully enclosed, I want to say Ecamm was the name of the vendor. I think that's what it is, Ecamm.
Okay.
So there was a cage, it was fully powered, it had all of the plug-ins, so you could plug your stuff into there, and there weren't a whole ton of wires hanging around the whole cage, and I didn't get a chance to go by and see it, and I was kind of mad.
Yeah, I didn't see that, but maybe that's a product or a concept and product that will allow you and I to talk a little bit about the whole HDSLR versus compact digital cinema camera thing. You know, the death of DSLR and that conversation, because of course, you know, there are people who are, you know, sounding their trumpets that the end is near,
right.
And then there are other people saying that it's not, and it's probably a worthwhile. Bless you, nice. That's a medical grade cloth I saw there. Did you just breathe something in to keep you awake? I think the night is kicking in. So the conversation is, you know, whether or not we really are in a shift, because I've been doing workshops for almost 2 years that have been focused really on production. The C47 is not a DSLR website; it's a production-based website,
right.
And most of the sessions that I teach are about understanding the language of cinematography and filmmaking and lighting and audio and those things. We happen to be using DSLR cameras because those are the cameras that are affordable, that have large sensors, and we can put any lens that we want on them, or pretty much any lens. But now we're using AF100s in there, and we'll be putting F3s in those classes, and we'll be putting FS100s, and you know, trying to get an Arri Alexa when we can, and other cameras. Red Epic is a fantastic camera system. But I think that, you know, a lot of people have a lot of very strong opinions, but the reality is that we are going to use the tool that is within the budget of the project that we're working with, and that will allow us to create the best possible picture that we can, the best possible images. DSLRs will not go away for a percentage of people out there. Clearly, the professional still photographer who's transitioning to video will gravitate to DSLRs for a lot of what they do. But I think a lot of the future of the DSLR form factor has to do with what manufacturers like Canon do with their cameras.
Right.
If they update those cameras to have the 50 megabits per second 422 codec that they're using in their video cameras, if the cameras have a Thunderbolt port on the side and we can do an uncompressed record, or we can take a, you know, a recording that's a 10-bit recording as opposed to an 8-bit in some form or another, then I think that those camera systems will continue to be used because of their form factor and the fact that they can get into very, very small spaces. But we're clearly seeing video cameras like the FS100 come to market now that have that small form factor, maybe not as small as a DSLR, and those have super 35 millimeter sensors in them, and they are designed not to be still cameras, though Red, you know, is an exception to that. They are designed to be video cameras. And it's going to be an interesting year to see where the market goes we don't know how people will adopt. We don't know how people will change. I can tell you I'm selling my EX1 not because it's not a usable camera. A lot of people are still buying small chip cameras. They are great running gun cameras. They're great for a lot of production. It just depends on what kind of stuff that you're doing. Are you shooting cinematically exclusively, or are you shooting a lot of broadcast-based stuff and other types of work? So, what are your thoughts on that, Mitch? How do you feel about that whole thing?
Well, I want HDLSRs to stay around forever because that's what I'm all about.
Yes.
I think that there are enough. I agree with you that obviously that the 5D Mark III or whatever comes next will set quite a bit of a tone, which is one of the reasons why I think that Canon is taking their time to get it out as opposed to rushing it. But realistically, the low-end market, I mean, I don't remember who was the first one I really heard talk about it, but the commoditization of movie making has sort of come from all of these HDLSRs. The market is now wide open in terms of letting people make the movie that they always wanted to make.
Right.
And so that's not going to go away with these new cameras because the new ones are still costs $10,000 sort of at a early adopter phase or more. So, when you can, somebody told me at one of the parties the other night at NAB that they can't find good music video work anymore because the 5D and 7D are so cheap that most of the music video business is expecting a music video to cost $5,000 or less.
Yes, and music videos don't make money anymore either.
Right.
There's no MTV. I mean, it exists, but it's not about music videos.
Yeah, right. It's about documentaries.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. That's probably not the right term.
Yeah, what's the right term? Survivor.
Crapumentaries, I think is what they're called.
Yeah, there is no more music, is there?
No.
So, I mean, realistically, I think things will be fleshing out over the next year, depending upon what Canon comes out with. But I still think that for the next 3 to 5 years, HDLSRs will be quite a big hunk of the market.
Yeah.
One of the other things that Vincent Laforet taught me is that movie makers often rent their equipment. And so those who choose to rent will be able to also afford more of the F3s, the F100s, the F101s, whatevers, because they're lower cost than the super high end.
Yeah, I think that what excites me is that DSLR cameras allow anybody to learn the language of cinematography, and the language of cinematography is not the language of a videography. Gain and small chips and things like that don't allow you to understand photography / cinematography. So this is really the sea change, is that we can I'm educating people on that language, which then allows them to learn the language of filmmaking. Wide shots have deep depth of field. As we get in tighter, we get a shallower depth of field. The type of coverage that you get. I mean, these are some of the things, but not all of the things. I mean, we cover a lot more than that when I do my 2-week program. My 3-day workshops are, let's get up to speed. You need to get in there into the trenches and understand how it all works so you can get down to business. But filmmaking is really about storytelling, and there's a language that exists there. There are agreements. There's reasons that we shoot at 24 frames per second. There's reasons that we set our shutter speed to a 50th, really a 48th, or our shutter angle to a 180 degree, because that's something, it's all based on agreements. It's completely arbitrary, but we settled on 24 frames per second. We settled on a shutter angle or shutter speed that exposes each of those frames for exactly half the amount of time. And that's the move, that's the, the thing that we're looking at. And we're not the people who can change that. I'm not saying that we can't, but people like James Cameron and Peter Jackson and George Lucas, if they want to start making movies at 48 frames per second and they can convince us that there's something different about that, then that's okay. I'm open to that. But in reality, it's the magic of that you're looking at something that is not completely real. That is the agreement of what is cinematic. And we have all the ingredients now. We have the imager size, the sensor size that approximates Super 35. We have the frame rate. We have the ability to capture enough latitude so that we can make that image look a certain way. And that's really what's exciting. I mean, I'm assuming that when we do the Filmmakers Intensive this summer, that the people who show up with their camera systems are going to have everything from a 5D Mark II, a 60D, all the way up to an F3. Maybe there'll even be somebody there with a RED camera. And, that's exciting to me. It's not about a specific camera model, but it is about having that, all the ingredients. And that's what's exciting, is that the ingredients are all there now and weren't until RED really came into the market and started to offer something, and then as far as cost effectively, and then of course we were all taken by surprise with what happened with DSLRs, because we were all throwing 35mm lens adapters on front of small chip cameras to get the look, so we could get that other ingredient. And then along came the D90, 5D Mark II, 7D, 60D, now Rebel cameras. We get them from other manufacturers as well, but they're just not tuned as well as the Canon cameras, which is why we're using the Canon cameras.
Right.
Nikon hasn't stepped up to the plate yet. They haven't given us a camera yet that allows us to have that control. And I wouldn't be surprised if Sony did at a certain point, but they still haven't yet in that form factor.
To sort of summarize, one of my feelings on that is that I still like to shoot stills a lot. And one of the reasons for me wanting to stick with a DSLR is that I can do both. Now, I know you can get stills out of RED, but most of the other movie cameras that we've been talking about, the F3s or whatever, aren't designed for doing stills. And so, to me, the ability to do both is still very valuable. Now, you mentioned your filmmakers I want to say intensive coming up. I know you want to give a little plug for that, so let's tell about that.
So it's the second year of the program. It's a 2-week program that runs during the last week of July and the first week of August. It'll happen in New York. There's about 8 instructors, and it is focused specifically and wholly on narrative fictional filmmaking. So the first week of the program is based on craft, and then the second week is based on actually doing a real-world film project. People will work with actors, and we'll have DPs. Whoa, what was that? A little fancy little background. Nice stuff.
It was a mistake, okay? Quit pointing out my mistakes.
I'm not. I'm just seeing stuff on the left-hand side there. So so it's really great. We've got some great people in the program. A good friend of mine, Skip Sudduth, who has directed a lot of episodic television, but he's also been in movies like Flawless and Ronin. He was on Third Watch for many years, but he's directed CSI New York, ER, a bunch of other episodic type television shows. Sound recorders, film editors, all these types of people. Now I've got a little scratch in my throat. What are you doing to me, Mitch, here? Hold on a second.
I'm passing it over the wire to you.
That's not... Did the mute work?
Yes, it did.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So, so I'm very excited about the program because it really is, as its name implies, intensive. It's 9 hours of actual class instruction every day. Everybody lives in a university setting, and last year when we did the program, it was about 18 to 20 hours worth of work every single day. So people are serious. they can go to the filmmakersintensive.com or just to my site, the c47.com, and there'll be a link to it. And you have to have a little bit of knowledge to be in the program. You fill out the application, and as long as you know how to operate a camera and understand the basics of cinematography, you know, ISO, aperture, shutter speed, and you have basic editing skills, that's really what's required. And more than anything, what's required is the fact that you're passionate. I would say that most of the people who come to the program are working professionals who want to up their game. They may not want to make a narrative film, but they want to understand how that collaborative filmmaking works, and then they may go back to their video production company or whatever else they're doing in their business and really up the types of stories that they're able to create. So thank you for letting me talk about that, and hopefully people will come to the site and fill out the application, and I can have a conversation with about whether or not it's a good fit for them. We take about 30 to 40 people altogether for the program, and it's fun.
It sounds like a lot of fun.
A lot of work.
Yeah.
Huh?
What
were you going to say?
If I had a freebie, I mean, if I had the chance to come.
Wow, interesting.
Just kidding.
I heard that. It is an immersive environment, and we have a lot of great equipment sponsors who are providing equipment. Last year, Kino Flow sent 25 or 30 lights for us to use. You know, we have Rode on board. A bunch of other really great companies, you know, who are supporting the program. People are responsible for bringing their own camera system, but we try to fill in as many of the blanks as we can, and we also provide the editing systems and things like that. So it's a lot of instruction, it's a lot of information, and it's sort of like mini film school for people who didn't get to go to film school, and then they get to take that knowledge and move forward with it. They're not going to get 4 years worth of film school, but they are going to get an experience that's going to take them out on the other end, really understanding a lot more of the way this works.
For somebody like me, what I was really trying to say is that sounds like a great opportunity to get the kind of experience to move up from stills to learning how to make the things correctly, as opposed to just hacking it like what I'm doing now.
Well, you know, it's I think we're all hacking it a little bit. You know, that's part of what we do. But
sure.
I can tell you that two of the people who came to the program last year were professional still photographers, and both of them were incredibly good at what they did, and they were sort of the perfect potential directors of photography. And one of them now is actually somebody I hire. He's based out of New York, and he's one of my DPs.
Wow.
And you know, it's not that that's what the program's about, but if there are people who are really great at their craft and they're interested in moving into, you know, image making this way, it is a great way to do that. We're not teaching people how to use a DSLR in this program. That's not what this is about. It's not about those things. It's about the language of filmmaking. It's about cinematography, which includes camera and lighting. It's about audio recording and sound recording. It's about directing. It's about working with actors. It's about working with a crew. It's about understanding the hierarchy of producer, director, assistant director, director of photography, you know, all of the people that are part of that, and understanding how that machine works and how it can work really, really well or really, really horribly badly, and what the ramifications of that are. And so it's very real world in sort of a condensed little environment. And, you know, classes on writing, on editing for narrative, and you know, information's on the site, but it is an exciting thing, and it's not for people who, again, are necessarily trying to shoot a feature film when they're done with the program, but it is about upping your game and getting to that next level, and it's not for everyone. It really isn't. You know, anybody can go do the 3-day workshop or a 5-day workshop to get up to speed on this stuff, but this is for people who want to go down the rabbit hole, and it's we're going to do that in the program. So yeah.
Super duper.
Yes.
There is a question in the chat room. Did you see the 8K projection booth at NAB? Isn't that much more practical as a film and still replacement resolution?
I did not. Yeah, I did not see the booth. I can tell you this, that we're going to jump very quickly from 1080 to 4K. 2K is not going to be what we're going to talk about in the future. But I've had lengthy discussions with ARRI about why they created the Arri Alexa to essentially be a 2K camera that resolves at 1920 by 1080. And one of the things, because Arri is a big company, they are the largest lighting company in the world. And if you saw their Arri L series LED Fresnels, they're pretty amazing. They're not cheap, but they are ridiculously cool lights. They are also a company that makes film scanners, where they scan film to high-resolution digital formats. And they can scan at 4K. The problem that they're having right now is that nobody's projecting at 4K.
Right.
So you can talk about future-proofing, and Red obviously has a different philosophy, but I think that we're just now looking at moving to a 4K resolution. And yes, you know, more pixels means more data, but it doesn't make a better story. And we always have to remember that what's being done with DSLR cameras right now, with all of their faults, their, you know, stair-stepping and moire and everything else, we are able to produce images now that we couldn't have produced 3 years ago unless we had gobs and gobs of money. It's that idea that we can now all afford the ingredients. We're going to make it, I promise. So, yeah, the answer is yes, but we're still not there. I mean, you know, we'll get there. It's inevitable. We live in a world of consumerism, but we're not going to be shooting 8K content anytime soon.
Right.
We will be talking to each other hopefully in 2 years, and we'll all be shooting 4K content. And I don't think that that's unrealistic.
Well, 4K content would be for theaters at that point, right? I mean, because it's not going to be TV.
It won't be anytime soon. I mean, you know, we'll probably at some point have a flip over, just like we did from standard definition to high definition, where one day we'll have 4K televisions, because they have to make televisions do new things in order to continue to sell televisions. That's the reality of what we're talking about.
Right.
But we're looking at images on TV right now at 1080, which, if shot well, if produced well, far surpass anything that we were watching even a few years ago. So it's sort of relative, and we will always forgive, you know, the fact that, you know, it's not the highest resolution, as long as it is a good story and it's shot well. And we can do that with DSLRs, with all of their shortcomings, even with the version 1s, the first round of these things. We can go to anybody and hear them bash anything. You can bash Red, you can bash the Alexa, you can bash the DSLRs, you can bash the Sony cameras. There's no one perfect camera system.
Right.
But every single one of those cameras, every single one of them, including a T3i and the 60D, can produce beautiful images if they're in the right hands. And you know, and lighting is the secret, because photography means painting with light, and that's what, you know, that's what that craft is about. And as long as somebody is taking any of these cameras and doing that well, you're going to be creating amazing pictures. So I think it's exciting. What were we talking about? I think that was sort of a long answer
that was
to that.
The answer to the 8K projection booth.
Yes, that's right. Good. Yes.
All right. So, what about other things that you saw at NAB that floated your boat?
Yes, and by the way, yes, 24 frames per second was decided upon a century ago, and people like James Cameron and Peter Jackson will update that, and whether or not it's accepted by the audience remains to be seen. But as it stands right now, 24p is what we associate with cinematic, and so we'll see how they look. There's beautiful stuff that's shot at 1080i. You know, these nature shows that we see, they're beautiful. I mean, this stuff that you see, they're in Nepal and they're, you know, in Africa. That stuff looks amazing. It's almost hyper realistic. But I watch those, you know, Planet Earth shows, and I am mesmerized by that image. It's not a cinematic image. We don't have that same motion blur that we have. Right. It can be shot. I mean, you know, it can be shot at 60 frames per second, you know, or even 60i resolving to 30, and it looks amazing. It doesn't all have to look the same. But when we're telling stories narratively, we have agreements, and we'll have to see whether or not we are going to accept that those agreements are going to change. They may not. They may change for James Cameron, but we'll have to see if the audience accepts it. And believe me, he's going to do things with 48 frames per second, and so is Peter Jackson, that we're not thinking about. They're still going to be very cinematic, but there's going to be something about having that extra information that I am going to guess is going to be a little bit different. But you know what's going to happen? The projectors are probably not going to be, projecting at 48 frames per second, at least not initially. So we're going to have something that was shot at 48 that's going to get basically played back at 24. So it's going to be interesting. Okay, so other things that were exciting to me. I think that just looking at my list, the Scorpion rig, which is not, yes, wow, you're going to make it.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm talking? Okay, good. So the Scorpion rig from Zacuto, which you probably saw also, is a really interesting rig to me because almost every shoulder-mounted rig that exists really has just one form factor. It sits on your body a certain way. And I put the Scorpion rig on my body, and it has this joint where you can just adjust all of the components so that it almost molds the shoulder-mounted rig to your body. And I found that that was a big step for a shoulder-mounted rig, and especially for a now a one-size-fits-all type of mentality. It's a Zacuto rig, so it's not going to be inexpensive, but I have felt that though I like rigs from all of the manufacturers, Cinovate, Zacuto, Red Rock Micro, Genesis, that from everything that I've tried, and I've built out a lot of rigs in the past, the Zacuto shoulder mount rigs to me have always been the best rigs for me. And I'm not a shoulder mount shooter, but I did find that this Scorpion system, you have to get used to having a camera on your shoulder. You can feel it after a very short period of time. And what happened with this the Scorpion is that because it sort of molds to your body and the way you want to stand and sort of hold that camera, it actually didn't create as much fatigue as the other rigs that I've tried, even by Zacuto in the past. So I think that that was a really interesting system. I think that we're not at the death of small chip cameras yet, and Panasonic has announced the HPX 250, which is an AVC Intra camera. So they're getting away from DVC Pro HD. I think that that's pretty interesting. And I just did an episode over at the Cinovate booth of some LED lights that they're coming to market with, which were called Paradigm lights originally. And they're going to be 12 LED or 24 LED lights. They're 3-watt LEDs, and you can watch a little episode on the C47 about them. But they're really cool. They're really nice light output and very compact. So I'm excited about those. And again, there's some things happening in the software area that I think is exciting. Storm, which is really designed for a Red Epic, or a Red post-production workflow, now is going to support the Alexa camera. That could also maybe support other cameras in the future. For all we know, they'll support the F3. You'll work in S-Log, and you'll work with an S3. And this means that there's other companies coming into the post and NLE market. We all know who Blackmagic is, Blackmagic Design. They're going to release a version of DaVinci Resolve for free, a free version of that. Red Giant Software has a free version of Colorista that's coming out. So we're getting some really interesting things happening in that space as well. And you probably, Mitch, saw the HyperDeck and the HyperDeck Studio from Blackmagic. That's a really interesting thing where we can record uncompressed data from these cameras. I don't know if we really want to work in uncompressed, by the way, Mitch. But they are giving you a $345 solution in the HyperDeck that you can stick a SSD drive into, and you can record uncompressed. So again, I'm not sold on that. But I will say that external recorders are a big story. And there's one company that surprised the hell out of me, which is Sound Devices, who makes some of the best audio equipment in the world. in this country at least, not necessarily in Europe, but in this country, sound devices recorders are sort of the de facto standard on mid to high-end productions when we're doing double system sound. They're mixers, they're recorders like the 744. They are what, with time code, are being used on sets when audio is being recorded. And they've now announced, and they will be shipping these PIX 220 and PIX 240 recorders that record into ProRes and DNX, which is Avid's codecs, and the recorders look pretty amazing. CF cards or SSDs. It has all of the great audio circuitry that you get in the sound devices boxes, but now we have a monitor and we can record to these codecs. And I think that that's a really interesting space. That's interesting to see somebody else. I mean, we were surprised when Atomus came around.
Right.
And the rumor is that those guys actually were some old Black Magic people, by the way. I don't know if that's true. I heard something about that. But, their recorders are really interesting. I will tell you that from the old Focus Enhancements days where we had hard drive-based recorders, I personally don't have faith in spinning platter recording. But I would love to try the Atomus recorders, the Ninja and soon-to-be Samurai, using SSDs or something that was more of a solid-state format. So yeah, how do you feel about that stuff?
Well, for the traditional still shooter, most of that's way up over my head.
Right.
I did see some conversation on Twitter today about the SSD maybe not being 100% reliable. Do you know anything about that?
I don't think that I've heard some of the same things, and I think that solid state is still not proven. We think because it doesn't have a spinning platter that it's completely reliable, but it doesn't matter if in IKEA they have something pounding on the chair 400,000 times, and they say that chair can last for 300 years. When you take 3 kids and you let them loose on that chair, it's very different than what happens inside of the laboratory.
That's true.
And the same is true when we're talking about things like solid-state media. We put that media into an environment where there's excessive humidity, there is a pin that gets messed up inside of there. I mean, I've had CF cards go bad because you put them into the camera or somehow something gets messed up. So I don't know what the true reliability is, but we're still dealing with zeros and ones. Right. Regardless of the fact if we have a spinning platter or not. They may not be the same ticking time bombs that the spinning platters are, but I still think that I'm not putting all of my faith in there. I think we have redundancy as part of our workflow for a long time to come, and if we're not thinking about taking tapeless and having that footage live in multiple places, then we're not really doing ourselves a favor, which is why products like ShotPut Pro exist, because we can take a card, put it into a card reader, and we can back up to 10 devices all at the same time, and that's a big deal. So.
Well, doesn't that imply that we really should be recording it twice? Straight out of the camera?
In theory, yes. I mean, the firmware update for the Area Alexa, actually, I mean, I keep going back to it, not because I can afford it, but just because of some of the features it has. There's a dual recording mode now. I mean, there's dual recording in a lot of these things where you can go to an external recorder and also record to the internal cards.
Right.
But in that situation, you're recording to 2 different codecs. But what the Area Alexa does is you have an S-by-S card in the camera and another S-by-S card, and it can record the same data at the same time to the 2 different cards. And that's pretty awesome as well. So yeah, I think I think that. So somebody says, do recorders really matter with cameras like the AF100 that only output 8-bit? Sure, because if you think about the AF100 and what it's recording to the SD cards in the camera, it's recording AVC HD at up to 24 megabits per second, and that's an 8-bit 420. At least coming out of the HD SDI on the AF100, you're getting an 8-bit 422, and you're bypassing that compression, that AVC HD compression. So there's a big difference to what's coming out of the back of something like an AF100 and what's being recorded to the cards. external recorders do matter. And I think that it's going to play a bigger role in what we're doing in production, because in order to bring a camera to market at a $300 to $7,500 price point, they're going to cripple the camera a little bit so that they can still have their higher end cameras.
Right.
You take a look at the FS100, it can't be the F3, and the F3 can't be the F35. There has to be somewhere in that, Canon is the most interesting company, though, because you and I have talked about this in the past, Mitch. Canon doesn't have an upmarket. Their most expensive camera is $8,500. And so they could do fun stuff if they wanted to. So, yeah.
It is very interesting, isn't it?
It is, yeah. There's other things that are silly things that I think that people need to look at. We talk about very ND filters. I've seen some, very ND filters from Heliopan recently, which have brass rings that are really, really sturdy, and they are a little bit more cost-effective than the Stingray. The inexpensive very NDs tend to ghost sometimes in certain light conditions, and that doesn't mean that people shouldn't look at them, but they need to be aware of the fact that in certain situations they may see ghosting because the quality of the glass, the optics that are in the filter, are not as good. But that too will evolve, and that's interesting. So.
It is interesting because I had a conversation with a couple of people the other day about whether or not you should even still put a skylight filter in front of your lens in order to protect it. And I'm like, well, how much are you spending on that? Well, I bought mine for $25. I said, well, you got a $2,000 lens and you're putting a $25 filter in front of it? I mean, how lame is that? So.
Absolutely. And I just did a workshop at Bear Images in San Francisco. They're based out of Palo Alto. They're very high-end workflow. Most of their photographers are medium format photographers, phase 1 backs, leaf backs. And I asked him, I said, what would you recommend putting in front of good glass? And, there's a number of solutions out there, but he basically said, B and W, B plus W, UV MRC filters, the multi-coated filters, because what they do is they really handle not only the UV, but they also tend to handle any IR or infrared contamination that comes from some of these sensors that have this wider range. Right. And I have seen many times, I'm sure you have seen at least once or twice, a lens that has been saved by a filter because it drops and the filter breaks but the lens doesn't. And that's a different discussion, but you're absolutely right. The quality of glass that you put in front of your lens is going to directly affect the quality of your picture. And if you put good glass in front of good glass, then you are doing yourself a favor. But that $25 filter is not going to get you better pictures. Your pictures are going to degrade. I would never put a $20 filter in front of a Zeiss lens. Man, can you imagine? And if anybody in your audience has ever put a Zeiss lens onto a DSLR camera like the 5D Mark II, they will see a dramatic difference in picture. And it's one of the things that people don't always understand is that we have compression, we have a lot of crippling going on in these cameras, but the glass that you use, I'm sure you've spoken to Shane about this, Shane Hurlburt. He's partial to Leica lenses in a lot of situations. Right. And they give you a look, but they also give you a quality of image that you can't get. And it's almost like you have not bypassed the compression of the camera, but you are really taking advantage of what that camera is capable of doing. And this is, in the end, the camera body is the computer system. But it's the lens, the optics, which are producing the picture that we can actually see, and it makes a huge difference. Which is why having these new video cameras coming to market in this space is also exciting, because we can put all of our lenses on them. Right. And that's really what's great. So yeah.
And I just have to go back to that. I mean, I have heard so many times people say that the Canon 5D Mark II gives blurry results. And I go back and I find out almost invariably it's what glass they're putting in front of it. It's
Absolutely.
not the camera itself, it's the fact that they're putting cheap glass on the front end of their camera. And hello, you know, when you suddenly jump up from, you know, like the Rebel XTI that I had, what was, I can't remember, 10 megapixels, to suddenly looking at one that's got 21, you know, suddenly all of your images look horrible because you got the old glass on them. All right, we gotta work on wrapping this up. I know you and I love to talk.
Okay, cool.
I've got to give in a plug for myself, by the way. The highlight.
I'm ready.
The highlight of the show for me was getting invited to be on Leo Laporte's show. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Leo
I
Laporte
read about
and
that.
Mostly Lisa's show.
Yes. How was that?
It was great. I had a very good time doing that show. I've always been a fan of Leo's because he's done all these tech geek shows for forever.
Right.
Now that I'm doing more video shows, it's rather fascinating to see that he screws up his broadcasts just as badly as I do.
Yeah.
I mean, we were 20-something minutes late getting started because of all the setup and all the other stuff during the show, and things didn't quite work out the way we thought they were going to work out when we first started either. So.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating. I hope they invite me back because I know they've got a lot of interest. You know, it's supposed to be a photography show, but like many people, they keep hearing that video is going to be the future, and so they've got a bunch of still photographers that want to learn video.
Yeah.
So I hope to be invited back. I thought I did fairly well.
Yeah, it's great. It's you have to spread the Planet 5D word, and you have a big audience, so it's good to do that.
I will ask Leo next time if I get to go back to pronounce my last name correctly, but that's okay.
He pronounced. Oh, you mean for you have to do it? Yes. Well, I'm sometimes Jem Schofield with an H, and sometimes Jem Schofield without an H. So you know, it's
yes. I can't type. All right, you had to
I'm just playing around.
Hey, at least I didn't put an L in it. It wasn't Schofield. All right.
Yes. Whoa, what is that? What is this? Ustreamer 143218. They're coming back to life. They came back. Do you think film is dead? That's a crazy question. We know film is going to disappear because there's not going to be the infrastructure for it. We're finally getting to the point where the quality of image that we can get in high-end digital cinema cameras is getting close as far as latitude to film. It doesn't mean that we don't want film to be around. Anyway, well, Mitch, you grew up doing photography, right?
Yes.
You have spent time in a darkroom.
Yes.
You look like you have. I do too. There's something magical about that. There was actually some conversations going on about, you know, at NAB. I remember I was at the Kessler party, and actually, you know, a friend of mine, the DP, Angus O'Born, and Steve Weiss were talking, and they were talking about, you know, missing being in a darkroom. And I grew up in a house where my father was a professional photographer, so we had a darkroom in our kitchen, and you know, I did photography as a kid, and there is a magic to that. There's a second part to, you know, taking the picture that is there on that film, and you think you know what it's going to be,
right,
but you're not sure, and then you get to sort of create that picture in the darkroom, and we don't have that. You know, that's very rare now, but I'm wondering where that's going to go in the future, because I don't think we will have that. We take a photograph and we can see it. We can shoot some video and we can see it. So we lose some of that magic. But what we do gain is we gain the ability for a much larger percentage of people out there to create these images because of what's available. And our tools are changing. But, you know, film won't die because there will always be a small percentage of diehards. But it's not going to live in this industry forever. I mean, you know, the Kodak plants have closed, and you know, the other, you know, Polaroid is being resurrected, but it's still. I think we clearly see that there's a change, Do you miss? Do you still work in a darkroom at all? Do you still shoot film at all?
No, I haven't shot film in years.
Do you miss it in some respects? Do you miss that part, the darkroom component of it?
A little bit, but the joy of actually, I mean, there was a mystery of not knowing what you were going to get, but there was also that fear of not knowing what you were going to get. And now that you can at least look on the back of the screen and say, I think that was pretty close to what I was hoping to get.
Yeah.
I think that warm and fuzzy is much better than the mystery from the past.
Got it.
For me.
Cool. Yeah. That's cool. Well, Filmbot thinks film will never die.
Right.
He's very adamant about it. Or she. We don't know if Filmbot's a... Yes.
I wonder if that's because his nickname is Filmbot.
Maybe.
Maybe.
But notice the bot part of it too. It's really there's definitely something going on there. So yeah.
They're coming to get you, Jem. I hear the sirens back there.
It was only a matter of time, They found me. I've been in the city for just a little too long. I've been in here one day too long, so now they have hunted me down. So, yeah.
All right. So let's do one takeaway. What was your biggest? Really, I mean, I think last year everybody said 2010 was NAB was all about HDLSRs. Is there a one phrase summary for 2011? Or not?
I think that the industry is moving towards a standard of 35 millimeter, super 35 millimeter imaging. So when we look at cameras, a year down the road, we are standardizing on that image or size based on super 35. And I think that everything that is being done in the industry, aside from, of course, the obvious 3D thing, is all about supporting that. The resolutions will go up, but I think we're standardizing on super 35 as our base for how we're going to create images as far as how we control depth of field. And again, you can have a super 35 imager and you can do 4K, you can do 2K, you can do 1080p. But I think that that's where we're going with our industry as we go forward. And so I think that that's really the thing, and we're seeing that these products that are coming out are supporting that. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see DSLRs talking about not APS-C sensors in the future, but from a marketing standpoint, they will do what everybody else is doing, and they'll call them Super 35 sensors. Huh. So I think that it's a healthy industry right now. I think that the outlook is very optimistic. NAB was definitely a busier show than it was last year.
Right.
And we're going to see a lot of stuff still shot on DSLRs, and I don't think that DSLRs as a form factor are going to go away, but I think that there's going to be a bigger mix of cameras, and I think most of us anticipated that anyway. We like choices, and the $5,000 to $10,000 price range is a price range that my market was very comfortable with to begin with. So we almost got spoiled by these $2,500 cameras.
Right.
But we want to get some of those features back that we've known and come to love in our standard video camcorders. But who knows? We might get a DSLR that has a lot of those features. So it could be good stuff. So exciting stuff. And I'm always excited to talk about it. It should be good.
You're always excited to talk about anything.
Related to this, yes, actually, I'm really excited because when I get back to New York, I'm going to be producing a series of instructional videos, which will eventually be on Canon's Digital Learning Center, which will allow people to take these DSLR cameras and in short 5-minute chunks teach them core principles of how to use filters and how to use map box systems and how to use follow focus systems and how to do certain things related to lighting and frame rates and shutter speed, so that hopefully we are moving forward and then everybody's really learning this language well, so that they can tell stories in a better way. So I think it's going to be a good year. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, Jem. Thank you so much. We appreciate
having
you
Mitch.
on. For those of you who are still here and who are watching on the replay, Planet 5D will be having several weekly shows coming up in the next, I think we have 3 more weeks scheduled, and after NAB I talked to so many people who are willing to come on the show. We will have quite a few coming up in the future, so that's pretty exciting for us, so stick around. For those of you who are in the chat room, if you wouldn't mind sticking around just a minute, I want to ask you guys a question while you're still here, but we're going to turn off the recording and say thank you to Jem.
Thank you, Mitch, and thanks everybody for coming.